At the wedding, a man forcibly carried the bride into a room, and no one around dared to stop him, not even her husband, who chose to remain silent. Afterward, the man stepped out and instructed the husband to go in and fulfill his marital duties. Helpless and swallowing his humiliation, the husband entered the room. He saw his wife curled up in a corner, covered in blood, terrified. She didn't want anyone to touch her again. Heartbroken, he turned and walked back outside. The man noticed that he hadn't followed orders. Enraged, he grabbed the husband by the throat and then viciously whipped him. The onlookers were too frightened to make a sound. After the beating, the man ordered the soldiers to drag the husband back inside, forcing him to consummate the marriage under their watch. In Barcelona, the local lord held the droit du seigneur, or right to claim the first night with any new bride. Refusing meant facing execution by hanging. The husband, Bernat, felt immense sorrow for his wife, but to keep his family alive, he tearfully apologized to her as he complied. Bernat was an honest and simple serf. Months later, his wife became pregnant, but since that night, she hadn't spoken a single word to him. Bernat stared into the distance, lost. Yet life had to go on. He prepared a cradle for the unborn child, though his wife still ignored him entirely. Soon, she gave birth to a boy. When Bernat saw the birthmark on the child's face, he finally smiled. Excitedly, he told his wife that this was their child, but she only glanced back at him. Bernat named the boy Arnau, just as he thought they could finally live in peace. Tragedy struck again. A group of soldiers came to take away his wife and child. Bernat fought with all his might to stop them, but he was powerless. Left to watch them being taken, determined to find his family, Bernat went to the city and began searching for any trace of his wife and son. After some inquiries, he found a former friend who once worked for the local lord. With the friend's help, Bernat was able to locate his son, Arnau. The friend told him that his wife had been made a wet nurse for the lord's son, whenever she managed to come home to feed her own child. Soldiers were always waiting to violate her. Bernat tried to take his son away, but his friend jumped in to stop him. In a scuffle, Bernat accidentally pushed his friend too hard, killing him by mistake. Knowing he had committed a serious crime, Bernat rushed back home, quickly gathered a few belongings, and fled. Upon hearing of the incident, the lord immediately sent soldiers to hunt Bernat down. Finding the house empty, they set it ablaze. Then, they released hunting dogs into the forest, pursuing him relentlessly. The man, Bernat, hid in a cave with his newborn son. To keep his child alive, he chewed the dry food himself and placed it into the baby's mouth. The lord learned that Bernat had not been captured, so he ordered a citywide manhunt. Bernat endured a night in the cave, and at dawn, continued his escape. After several days of trekking through rugged mountains, he finally saw a glimmer of hope. He planned to seek refuge with his elder sister. However, when he arrived in town, he discovered that a warrant had also been issued there. After inquiring around, he finally reached his sister's home. She and her husband, Grau, ran a pottery business. As soon as Bernat entered, the foreman mistook him for a beggar and tried to drive him out with a stick. Fortunately, his sister intervened just in time. Seeing her brother in such a desperate state, she compassionately took the child and handed him to a nursemaid. After learning about Bernat's ordeal, she discussed taking him in with her husband, but Grau staunchly refused to shelter a murderer, a crime punishable by death, and suggested they just give him some money to leave. His sister pleaded, saying that if they helped him hide for 1 year, he could apply for freedom. Moreover, Bernat had once given up his share of the inheritance to fund her dowry, enabling Grau to have his current business. Finally, Grau reluctantly agreed. Though Bernat was allowed to stay, he was treated no better than a slave. He lived in a flea-infested basement and ate food worse than pig slop. His son was temporarily cared for by a nursemaid, and Bernat was only allowed to see him twice a week. Here, any small misstep brought brutal punishment, but Bernat endured it all for his son's sake. Despite the harsh treatment, Bernat's strong work ethic soon earned him the foreman's approval, though he never received any pay. A year passed, and his sister informed Bernat that he was now a free citizen. However, whether citizen or slave, a murderer would still face the same punishment if caught. Looking at his son, who was just starting to walk, Bernat ultimately decided to stay. By 1329, Arnau had reached the age of 10, though Grau's family never treated him as kin. Grau forbade Arnau from calling him uncle, and even his cousin Margarita often bullied him. One evening, Margarita coaxed her two younger brothers into going to the beach to watch the moon. The three arrived at the shore, shouting and laughing, which attracted the attention of a night watchman. They quickly hid behind a boat, Arnau suggested they should go home, but Margarita convinced them to hide in the water until the watchman left. So, all three of them submerged themselves in the frigid seawater. The watchman searched for quite a while before finally leaving. By then, one of the younger brothers was nearly frozen, and Arnau and Margarita struggled to drag him back home. But as soon as they returned, Margarita claimed that the whole idea had been Arnau's. Furious, Grau shouted at Arnau to get out. The family hurried to warm the younger boy with hot water, but it was already too late. After the younger brother's burial, Grau began his revenge. At the funeral, the mother was inconsolable, sobbing uncontrollably, while Grau suppressed his simmering rage. After the service, Grau ordered the foreman to gather everyone and took a whip from the cabinet. He blamed the child's death on the nursemaid's failure to supervise, commanding that her clothes be stripped and that she be suspended, then lashed her mercilessly. Arnau cowered in Bernat's arms, but Grau insisted he watch the punishment to learn the consequences of wrongdoing. The brutal whipping continued as the slaves hung their heads, silently praying for the nursemaid. Arnau witnessed the horrific violence until the foreman informed Grau that the nursemaid was dead. To serve as a warning, Grau forbade anyone from cleaning the bloodstains from the floor, but Bernat, despite the opposition, instructed his son to fetch water and clean it. Having already decided it was time to leave, Bernat approached Grau to say goodbye, but Grau refused to let him go. If Bernat were captured, Grau would be implicated as well. He also belittled Bernat, saying he lacked survival skills and couldn't support Arnau, then promised to pay him wages in the future. For his son's sake, Bernat chose to endure the humiliation and stay. From that day on, Arnau no longer played with Margarita, watching her only from a distance up in a tree. There, he met another boy, Joan, who was also marked by hardship. Joan's mother had given birth to him but was confined to a small dark room. As her husband wanted nothing to do with her, Joan could only stand outside, calling out to his mother through a window. She would extend an aged hand from within. That was their only way of seeing each other. Here, the law dictated that any unfaithful woman must be imprisoned by her husband in a dark room until death. Despite Joan's bleak situation, Arnau envied him, for he himself had never seen his mother. That night, Arnau asked his father about his mother. Bernat told him that she had died shortly after he was born. He explained that for children who lose their mothers, God grants them another, the Virgin Mary, who hears their hearts and loves them more than any earthly mother could. The next day, Arnau and Joan went to the church to make a wish. They saw laborers hauling materials to build a new church. The priest explained that because they couldn't pay to have the church built, the workers transported stones from the port to construct it. Arnau wanted to help with the new church, but he couldn't lift the stones. Instead, he and Joan decided to bring water to the workers. In this way, the two lonely souls became close friends. But more tragedy soon struck. Bernat learned from the foreman that his sister had died. Bernat held Arnau close, weeping not only for the loss of his family but also in dread of the future. 1 year later, Grau married a woman from a fallen noble family. With this new status, he had to abandon his business and sell all his slaves. However, he kept Bernat to work in the stables, as it was his late wife's dying wish. With the priest's help, Bernat found a new place to live. Seeing Joan homeless, Bernat decided to adopt him as his godson. When Joan went to bid his mother farewell, he received no response. Climbing on a stool to peer through the window, he discovered that she had starved to death. For a 10-year-old, this was a brutal, heartbreaking loss. That night, Arnau and Joan attended the Virgin's procession ceremony, but Joan wept uncontrollably. Perhaps this was his way of releasing his grief, a necessary catharsis to move forward. The next day, the priest approached Bernat, expressing his hope that both boys could enter the church to study. Only knowledge could change their fate. In the end, Joan went to study at the church, while Arnau chose to stay at the stables to help his father. One day, Arnau offended a stableman, and in retaliation, the stableman tampered with the saddle. When the master's son rode the horse, the loosened saddle caused him to fall. The stableman then framed Arnau for the incident. The lady of the household brought Arnau inside, slapped him, and hurled cruel insults at him. Arnau despised this woman intensely, and in his anger, he stormed off. Arnau tried apologizing to the woman, but she demanded he kneel down and lick her shoes. Facing such humiliation, he had no choice but to submit. With the lady looking on haughtily, reveling in the degradation of a servant, Margarita also mocked him, sneering with contempt. Arnau vowed that one day he would repay all this humiliation, but the lady wasn't finished. She issued an order to all stables, forbidding anyone from employing Bernat. A year later, natural disasters devastated the crops, causing widespread famine. The poor faced starvation. The nobles hoarded grain, using the crisis to exploit the people. charging 10 times the normal price and limiting daily sales. When the desperate crowd protested, the nobles drove them away with sticks. Bernat pleaded with the grain seller, who turned around, revealing herself to be his former mistress. It was her doing all along. Anger simmered within Bernat, and in a desperate move, he grabbed a sack of rice. At this, the villagers swarmed him, seizing handfuls of the precious rice. In the ensuing chaos, Bernat clung to a small portion of rice and managed to escape. At home, he ground the rice into powder to stave off hunger, then gave all his remaining possessions to Arnau to safeguard. Arnau comforted his father, saying God would protect them. That night, Bernat pulled out a dagger. He had decided to do something drastic. At dawn, he stood among the crowd with a stone in hand, watching as soldiers oppressed the people. Seizing the moment, he charged forward and struck one of the soldiers with his stone. The villagers followed his lead, rushing into the granary and grabbing bags of rice. They hadn't gone far before more soldiers intercepted them. The people dropped the rice and fought the soldiers with all their might. The crowd's numbers soon overwhelmed the soldiers, who fled. The villagers quickly organized and marched to the palace gates, shouting for their rights, but soldiers surrounded them again. Though they resisted fiercely, it was a losing battle. Bernat was captured by a soldier, and the officer announced he would execute Bernat as an example to intimidate the populace. Bernat and others were taken to the execution grounds. Arnau tried to retrieve his father's body, but the guard told him it had to hang all night and would be discarded in the trash the next day. At that moment, the family of the mistress of the house came to the place of execution, and stood talking about the father of the boy. Arnau wanted to confront them, but the priest held him back, warning that it would only bring him further disgrace. The priest told him that, for now, the most important thing was to stay alive. Arnau vowed that one day he would make them kneel before him. He would not allow anyone to ridicule his father. Now, an orphan, he would have to walk his path alone, without the shelter of others. He would have to run harder in life's race. Arnau went to the quarry to work as a porter. Though at only 10 years old, he could barely lift the stones. Thankfully, the workers looked out for him, helping him with a headscarf and giving him smaller stones to carry. Even so, each step was a struggle, requiring every ounce of his strength, but he clenched his teeth and pushed forward, driven by a purpose in his heart, for the Virgin Mary, for his father, and for himself. And so, Arnau labored in the market for 10 years, growing into a tall, strong young man. One day, Arnau encountered the daughter of a new tenant, Ildefonso, and with just one glance, they felt an instant attraction. Due to lack of room, their room had to be vacated for the new tenant. Out of respect for Arnau's father, the landlord allowed them to sleep on mats downstairs. During dinner, Arnau and Ildefonso couldn't take their eyes off each other. This caught the attention of Ildefonso's father, Gaston, who looked down on Arnau as a mere laborer. He harshly ordered his daughter to finish eating and go back to her room. However, whenever they could, Ildefonso and Arnau snuck off to meet, parting only reluctantly each time. One day, Ildefonso slipped out to see Arnau under the pretense of buying groceries, but her brother caught her and dragged her back, telling their father what he had seen. Gaston warned Arnau to stay away from his daughter or he would have the landlord evict them. Undeterred, Arnau went to the church to find the priest. Arnau proposed to Ildefonso, but Gaston mocked him mercilessly. Taking a piece of pork from a basket, he sneered, "You can't even afford this with a month's wages. What makes you think you can marry my daughter?" The priest offered to have the guild guarantee a loan for Arnau, but Gaston dismissed the idea with annoyance. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Gaston's master, Nicolau, entered, and Gaston's demeanor immediately changed to a warm smile. He immediately greeted him with a smile and betrothed his daughter to Nicolau to his face. Just because he could afford pork, Gaston even threw a few coins at Arnau, telling him to leave at once. Arnau was furious and wanted to strike him but was held back by the priest and forced to walk away. On the day of Ildefonso and Nicolau's wedding, Arnau watched from afar. Joan tried to console him, saying, "Forget her, you'll find someone better." 3 years later, the construction of the new church was completed. During the celebration, Arnau saw Ildefonso again, and the two danced together. Unable to bear it, Nicolau stormed over and dragged Ildefonso away, scolding and beating her once they returned home. That evening, the foreman from the quarry invited everyone over to celebrate because Joan had received an acceptance letter from the university. Joan mentioned that he wished Arnau would marry before he left. The priest also encouraged Arnau, saying it was time for him to settle down. The foreman was more than willing to offer his daughter, Hoven, to Arnau, even promising to give them a house. After all, he had watched Arnau grow up, but Arnau hesitated. The next day, Ildefonso, covered in bruises, waited for Arnau at the quarry. Despite the years apart, their love had never faded. Arnau swept Eldis up in his arms and carried her into a small room, where they gave in to their passion. But under local law, if such an affair were discovered, a woman could be imprisoned by her husband in a dark room for life. Eventually, Arnau married Hoven. Perhaps he did it for Joan's future, or perhaps to protect Eldis, but he stopped going to the beach. Nevertheless, Eldis continued to wait there for him, day after day. One day, while Hoven was away, Eldis went to Arnau's house and begged him to run away with her. Otherwise, she would reveal their affair to everyone. That evening, Arnau heard a commotion outside. It turned out that King Pedro had declared war, and many peasants were enlisting, hoping to change their fate. Arnau, seeing a chance for redemption, insisted on enlisting despite Hoven's objections. The next morning, Eldis waited at the beach for Arnau. She saw a figure approaching the small hut, but when she lifted the curtain, she realized it was her husband. She tried to escape, only to run into her father. The two of them bound her and locked her in a chest. When her sister came to bring her food, her husband spat into the dish before handing it over. Eldis begged her sister to help her escape. She didn't want to be locked away forever. The following day, soldiers arrived to take her to trial, but when they opened the chest, it was her sister inside. Her sister claimed Eldis had stolen her cloak and escaped. Enraged, her husband smashed the chest and vowed to bring her back. Eldis, now a fugitive, covered herself to avoid recognition and decided to search for Arnau on the battlefield. While resting for a moment, she let her guard down and was soon pursued by two soldiers, forcing her to turn south along a narrow path. That night, a group of kind strangers offered her roasted chicken and hot water, but the next morning, she woke to find herself alone and her money was gone. Now penniless, she wondered how she could ever find Arnau. At the riverbank, she asked a ferryman to take her across, but after hearing her story, he showed no sympathy and dragged her into his tent, assaulting her. Poor Eldis continued her journey, now begging her way forward. One day, Eldis encountered a group of shabby women who helped her wash up, gave her clean clothes, and then asked her some questions. When they learned she was searching for someone named Arnau, one of the women almost broke down in tears but quickly held back, promising to go to the military camp the next day to gather information. The following day, she found a contact and finally located Arnau, though she could only watch him from afar. A nearby soldier mentioned that Arnau had been promoted to a guard and was married to a woman named Hoven. The woman realizes that Eldis has deceived her and returns to beat her with a stick. Eldis defended herself, saying that she and Arnau had been intimate before he married Hoven, and that she considered him her true husband for life. Hearing this, the woman shared her own painful past. She once had a son also named Arnau, but he had been taken from her. She had searched for years without success, and whenever she thought of him, she wept bitterly. This woman, as it turned out, was Arnau's mother. Too afraid to reveal her identity, she ultimately told Eldis that Arnau was dead. 5 years later, the war ended, and Arnau wanted to return to his wife, but he was unaware that disaster was about to strike again. A sudden plague swept through, leaving bodies wrapped in cloth piling up everywhere. Believers whipped themselves, seeking penance for their sins, but against the plague, people felt utterly helpless. Seeing this, Arnau thought of his wife and hurried home, only to find that she too had fallen victim. Her body was decaying, and as he tried to find a doctor, she told him it was too late and simply wanted to look at him a little longer. Arnau, overwhelmed with guilt, wept as he looked at his wife. That night, she passed away. The next day, Arnau prepared her body, and when the cleanup crew arrived, he gently placed her on the cart. At that moment, he felt utterly abandoned by the world. In the church, a consensus emerged that the plague wasn't a natural event but was caused by Jews poisoning the wells, and calls spread to execute all of them. Ignoring age or innocence, they sought to annihilate the Jewish community. Arnau intervened, arguing that children were innocent, but the mob, blinded by hatred, was determined to see the massacre through. Left with no choice, Arnau drew his dagger and wounded one of the men, successfully forcing the mob to retreat. He then hid the children in the church crypt, but Sahat, who was caring for the children, insisted he must leave to protect his own master. After they descended to the basement, Arnau realized he had been stabbed during the scuffle. Losing blood, he fell unconscious, but fortunately, the children's father found him and brought a doctor to treat his wounds. A few days later, soldiers announced that the plague had ended, and Arnau had mostly recovered. The father of the children, Hasdai, turned out to be the wealthiest merchant in the area, with even half the local nobility indebted to him. Arnau visited Hasdai to say goodbye, but Hasdai insisted he stay. saying he still owed Arnau a debt of gratitude. Hasdai offered to give him anything money, even a noble title, but Arnau was uninterested in such rewards. He simply wanted to become a money changer. Hasdai offered to send Sahat to help him. As Sahat was highly skilled in business, Arnau gladly accepted, and from that point on, Sahat began teaching him the art of commerce. The king arranged for his daughter to marry a commoner, Arnau, but Eleanor protested fiercely, believing that someone of Arnau's peasant origins was utterly unworthy of her. However, the king silenced her objections with a stern reprimand. After ousting Grau's family, Arnau's business flourishes and he becomes the richest businessman in Barcelona, and lent the king a large sum of money to finance his army. Grateful, the king granted Arnau a noble title and arranged for his daughter to marry him. Arnau dared not refuse such a royal reward, yet this marriage would again change the course of his life. Since this was merely a transaction of power, a marriage without love, it was bound to become a battleground. Joan, now a monk, traveled specifically to preside over the wedding ceremony. In the crowd, Mar wept with reddened eyes, for she had already fallen in love with Arnau. Arnau was well aware of her feelings. After the wedding, he and Eleanor returned to his new estate. Arnau gathered the local villagers and announced the abolition of the nobles' rights to inherit their servants' property and to spend the wedding night with their servants. He declared the villagers free. The crowd erupted in celebration, but his actions angered the nobility, as it not only infringed on their rights but also fueled Eleanor's resentment. Eleanor loathed this marriage to a peasant that made her feel disgraced and humiliated. This led her to form a bold plan. She went to consult a lawyer, asking how much of her husband's wealth she would inherit if he were to die. The lawyer explained that without an heir, she would only have rights to his assets for 1 year, after which everything would go to the church. 1 year was far too short for Eleanor's ambitions. Returning home, she told Arnau that she wanted to have a child, but with no foundation of love. Arnau had never shared her bed since their wedding. He flatly refused her request. Enraged, Eleanor sought out Joan and tearfully confessed her grievances, saying that Arnau's heart was with his adopted daughter, Mar, and that he had never truly looked at her since the marriage. She even announced her plans to marry Mar off and asked Joan for help in rekindling her marriage. Bound by the vows he'd made during their wedding, Joan reluctantly agreed, but little did he know that in agreeing, he would unwittingly become a pawn in Eleanor's schemes, and a sinner in his own eyes. Eleanor arranged for a stranger to kidnap Arnau's adopted daughter, Mar, and to force himself upon her. The man protested, saying this was punishable by death, but Eleanor assured him he had nothing to fear. Under local law, as long as the guardian of the victim agreed for her to marry her attacker, he would be exempt from punishment and he'd even receive a generous dowry afterward. Realizing he had no choice but to obey, he finally agreed. One day, when Mar was alone, he snuck up behind her, covered her with a sack, and took her back to his house. No amount of her screams or pleas helped her escape. When Arnau learned of the kidnapping, he immediately took up his sword and hurried home. As he reached his doorstep, he found a crowd of soldiers and villagers gathered, all ready to join him in seeking justice. This was exactly what Eleanor had anticipated. At the kidnapper's house, the man quickly confessed to everything, saying he had acted out of his overwhelming love for March. Seeing that she hadn't married, he'd finally committed this monstrous act, claiming he was willing to marry her and make things right. But Arnau knew this was a heinous crime that deserved punishment under the law. Joan, however, urged Arnau to consider marriage as Mar's only way forward. It would protect her reputation and fulfill his duty as a father. Arnau was torn but eventually gave in, agreeing to the marriage like a broken man. Sahat, unable to accept Arnau's decision, left without a word. Mar appeared, looking like a lost child, hoping her father would rescue her and bring her home. But Arnau could only look at her helplessly, unable to do anything. As Arnau turned to leave, Mar fell to her knees, weeping in despair. Back at home, Arnau locked himself in his room and cried, his heart broken, overcome by guilt. Joan also left town. Meanwhile, Eleanor conspired with Margarita to further ruin Arnau. They spread vile rumors, accusing the Jewish community of desecrating holy relics and crucifying children, igniting the townspeople's hatred and inciting them to wipe out the Jews. Unable to bear the thought of their suffering, Arnau offered £50,000 to purchase the lives of all the Jews. However, the official in charge demanded 3 prisoners as a sacrifice to placate public anger. Arnau told Hasdai about the decision, and to Arnau's despair, Hasdai, accompanied by 2 elderly men, volunteered to face execution by fire. Arnau was overwhelmed with grief, holding Hasdai's daughter and weeping as he watched his friend die. In that moment, Eleanor stepped forward from the crowd, accusing Arnau of adultery with a Jewish woman. Faced with a stern interrogation by the judge, Arnau firmly stated that he hadn't been with a woman in years, yet it was clear this was a premeditated trial. The judge piled accusations upon him, leaving Arnau unable to defend himself, and he was ultimately thrown into prison. Meanwhile, Margarita approached the church officials, accusing Arnau of murdering her brother and causing her mother's death, dredging up every possible charge against him. Not stopping there, she incited officials who despised Arnau, spreading rumors that his mother practiced witchcraft. The officials captured his mother and brought her to Barcelona, imprisoning her in the cell next to Arnau's. However, to protect her son, she kept her back turned, refusing to acknowledge him. Joan, hearing of Arnau's unjust imprisonment, rushed to his aid. Powerless and penniless, he humbled himself, kneeling before the church officials to plead for Arnau's release. But the officials saw an opportunity. If Arnau died, his entire estate would pass to the church. They coldly instructed Joan to convince Arnau to confess to his supposed crimes, knowing this might be his last chance to see Arnau. Joan agreed and visited the cell. Seeing Arnau covered in wounds from torture, they wept in each other's arms. Arnau asked if he might see Mar one last time before he died, to apologize for what had happened to her. Joan located Mar, who shared that her husband had died years ago, and though she still harbored resentment, her heart softened upon hearing of Arnau's plight. At the same time, Sahat received news of Arnau's imprisonment and sold everything he owned to fund a rescue mission. He approached the prince, reminding him that the king owed his former master a large sum of war debt, and if Arnau were executed, the debt would fall upon the crown. This risked the king's reputation, Sahat argued, but if the prince saved Arnau, the debt could be absolved. The prince, uncertain, promised to consult with the king. The following day, Arnau was once again dragged before the court. Soldiers presented his mother as a witness and demanded to know if she was indeed Arnau's mother. She steadfastly denied any relationship, refusing to identify herself in order to protect him. Meanwhile, Sahat and Eldis rallied villagers outside the church, appealing to everyone whom Arnau had ever helped. United in their conviction that Arnau was innocent, the villagers decided to take action and marched toward the courthouse, carrying a statue of the Virgin Mary as a symbol of their devotion. Inside the court, the officials continued to torment Arnau's mother, forcibly turning her face toward him, trying to break her resolve until the commotion outside grew too loud to ignore. The crowd, now completely surrounding the courthouse, began throwing stones, forcing the officials to stop. At that moment, royal soldiers arrived, and their commander entered the court, ordering the church officials to release Arnau at once. When they refused, the commander issued a final warning, declaring it a direct order from the king. Reluctantly, the church officials surrendered. The commander stepped outside and announced Arnau's release to the crowd, who rushed in, carrying Arnau out. His mother, overcome with emotion, wept openly. As the crowd dispersed, Eldis quietly left. Perhaps her love for Arnau was better honored by letting him go. Knowing that life had irrevocably changed, Joan, realizing the depths of his own guilt, set Eleanor's chambers ablaze, determined to atone by perishing with her. Together, they met their end in the flames, bringing their sins to a final close. Years later, Arnau built a magnificent church dedicated to the Virgin Mary by the sea, which became known as the Cathedral of the Sea. And with that, the film concludes. Thank you for watching. I'm your film enthusiast, signing off.